My name is Mary Burke-Pitts, and I'm presenting on the nature of trees. This is for the fourth annual Daoist Gate Conference. Thanks for having me. I'm recording from Asheville, North Carolina, and I'll share some photos of the various forests and trees, including in my area, and then also in Maine and in Southern Oregon. So let me just pull up my presentation and then we'll get started. Yeah, so originally I attended a lecture with Jeffrey Yuen that was in 2016. And Jeffrey taught in the Acadia National Forest of Maine. It was a unique lecture because it was in the outdoor classroom. We got to walk through the forest and learn about the trees that were growing, discover some of the practices, including standing meditation or other Taoist rituals that were taught. And also, we learned about Taoist numerology in terms of sort of the taxonomy of trees. So I'm not a botanist, but I am an herbalist, and I love to spend time in forests and nature, and so I do have a deep connection to the land, and that's one of the inspirations for sorting through lecture notes from about 7 years ago. I still practice and reference these types of things a lot just because I find it very meaningful. The other areas that I'll also show photos of and reference are in Southern Oregon. Basically, it's in wilderness areas that were affected by the bootleg fire. So I'll talk about my teacher Lindsey Way's land that burned back in 2021. And then I've also added some photos from where I live, which is the land surrounding Western North Carolina that was recently affected by the floods from the Hurricane Helene. So I just wanted to show this one photo also of my teacher, Joe Hollis, who passed away last fall on November 7th. Joe was my first teacher, who first introduced me to Taoism. So basically, I became a student of Chinese medicine because I was a student of his. I interned at his home, the land that he lived on called Mountain Gardens, which is in Burnsville, North Carolina. And that's at the edge of the Pisgah National Forest where his land and project are located. This particular photo of Joe was 1 year or so before he died. And he had, there was just a fire that affected his land. It was a fire from human error, and it burned down his library. He had been collecting books for over 50 years in topics including botany and Chinese medicine and Taoism and more. So that was a pretty tragic event. And basically, it did not torch the entire area, but it did take out some pretty significant infrastructure. And then one of the things that I have found the most impressive in terms of sort of looking towards an elder, looking towards teachers who have lived a type of lifestyle that's inspiring, and especially as it relates to the topic of Taoism. But Joe lived as a hermit. He lived a very simple life, and he lived off the grid. And he was on hospice when he passed away last fall. And so he was surrounded by some of his family, his son, and also his students, many herbalists that were there, basically taking care of him at the end of life. And on some occasions when he was still more mobile, but also he had been started morphine just because he was in a lot of pain. And that affected his cognition at the time. So conversations started to become tricky. But I remember that just to find a way to sort of connect to him in a pretty hard time, I would collect some leaves that had fallen on his property and just bring them up to where he was sitting on his porch, and he could, right off the top of his head, even with his like sort of cognition loss. He could recognize any tree just from its leaf. So I think that's pretty impressive. And yeah, Joe taught so many people how to return to the land and live close to forests and medicine. So just thought I would share that with you all. The other topics that go back to 2016 in reference to Jeffrey's lecture on the nature of trees were about numerology. So in terms of what I'm presenting right here, we're just going to look at the study of patterns. And then as you study the patterns, then you can apply these ideas to any plant medicine. So not just trees. So that's something important to remember. Also, I just want to point out that I am not a botanist, nor am I would say, nor am I a mathematician, but I do think that some of this information is very helpful. And then in other ways, it just makes things make more sense. Sort of the taxonomy of things, how to ID things and key things out. So something that came up during the Nature of Tree lecture back in 2016 was learning the standing tree postures. So actually, if I think back, it probably was the first time that I had ever practiced the standing Qigong meditation. At that point in time, I wasn't somebody who was well versed in sort of the movement arts, but we did learn the Daoist ritual surrounding communing with the tree. Also, the standing postures at the level of the head, do 20, at the level of the chest, run 17, and also at the level of the lower abdomen, do 4. So in practicing stillness, through stillness comes the idea of endless possibilities. So over the years, these practices have become more a part of my life, and also through other teachers and examples that I'll reference throughout the lecture. So I would encourage everyone to try it if you haven't already. But again, this isn't, I'm not going to teach the standing tree posture nor demonstrate it, but you can always look it up with other folks in the Daoist gate community. So one thing I will attempt to say is the term Jian Zhuang. And so that is refers to standing like a tree. Basically, it's the standing posture for Qigong. In the word Zhan of Jian Zhuang is a word for oracle. So it has that basically radical within the Chinese character. It also has the character for Dian, as in Dian Tian, elixir field. So, within this standing posture, you can think of the possibility of having an awakening through that sort of concept of an oracle. And you could try supporting your body by seeing what is stirred internally. This comes from the energetics of wood itself, which is connected with change or other elements of other 5 elements, let's just say. But to stand like a tree is to practice communicating with the trees. And I'll show you a little bit more about that. But again, that's not the focus. So the focus of this lecture is on the 7 corporeal soul. In short, you can call them the 7 Po. So the 7 Po is anything living. It could include rocks or trees, also humans and animals. They have a Po. In the human body, we have 7 orifices in total. These are our senses, the 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears. I mix those up, and then 1 mouth, of course. So that equals 7. The 7 Po also could be thought of as the 7 levels of existence. If you add in the 3 Hun, which is not the focus of this lecture, but the three hun do include sort of like the ethereal soul, and other aspects of basically your hard drive and sort of the records of your life. For example, if you add up those numbers, the three hun and the seven po, then in total you get 10. And 10 is a number that signifies completion. But just staying focused on one of these topics that I sort of excerpt from the original lecture, trees represent the seven po. They help us to overcome what we're fixated on. We all have seven po in us at one time, but some are inert. And you can think of the soul of a life is born into basically a child's body as a baby, and the corporal soul takes form. Basically, it becomes material. Another way of thinking about or understanding the corporal soul is we have pos, the seven po, that represent the effigy or sculpture of your life, particularly when it comes to the physical body. So that's like especially associated with the lungs and large intestine, but also other organs, associated with any physical parts of the body. And those are manifested with the po. Another way of thinking about it is if you witness or observe children, their spirits are like different than adults. And so when we talk about the po that become inert, it is sort of aspects of what we're like born into this world with and what we have, and then what sort of becomes active and manifests in its material form and or not. So I hope that makes sense. A little bit more about why would trees represent anything relating to the seven po. You can think of trees as the bridge between the hun and the po. Also, more specifically, humans and animals have both hun and po, but you can think of the seven po as in any life form, specifically just the seven po, as I mentioned already, like rocks or trees, including humans. Pos are also thought of as heavy and turbid, and they work on where the spirit is stuck. So an example of a po issue would be affecting your wei qi. Wei qi is associated with survival or respiratory system. So an overactive wei qi could be from traumatic events that happen in life. The po enable us to work out issues in our life, desires and basically thirst for existence. Basically a soul is born into a body. Why are we here? And, why do we, I suppose, like what we like and do what we do? But pos are less about emotions and they're more about our behavior and how we hold ourselves. So I guess I can say from my own personal experience, like through movement practices that I've learned in Taoism, I can testify that the way that I hold myself is different. Basically, the way I embody myself or my somatic experience is different. So therefore, I'm grateful for the practices I have learned over time, and I can say that they have sort of changed me. In a sense, some of the po that possibly were inert in other periods of my life, like my teen years or 20s, even early 30s, have sort of been come into more consciousness as I've aged and practiced some of these movement arts like standing meditation. So hopefully that's another encouragement. Again, just by learning about the trees, hopefully it allows you the inspiration to practice what is the possibility of understanding the po or corporeal soul for yourself, because I still think it's a bit of a tricky concept. But there are 7 trees that will help you to understand these levels of existence. And so I'm going to go through all of these trees. Some are just kind of categories of trees, but it starts with ginkgo. We'll move on to thorny trees, so anything that has a thorn or a pricker. The next in order are both elm and ash, so they're considered the third level of consciousness. Then maple, which is the fourth. Then anything with scales, so we'll look at a lot of the junipers and cedars and cypress kind of trees. They have scales, and that's followed by pine trees. And then finally, dead trees. That's the last of the 7 trees to understand the 7 Po. And trees are sentient beings. They are also sensual beings. So that's why if you stand with a tree, you will begin to know the part of yourself that you can't always listen to or understand, but the part of yourself that you know wants completion in this lifetime. So Poe's created motive for our reincarnation. The reason it becomes another Poe, our soul, is to satisfy what it hasn't fully experienced in a particular existence or other aspect of life. So I am referencing some of the Buddhist or Daoist philosophies and ideas of reincarnation, but I think even just simply, if you look at this one lifetime that you are living in, to fully experience completion in other aspects of life might be just to live out potentially your entire existence in this current lifetime, let's just say. So we'll look at the 9 peaks or the 9 palaces in order to cultivate whatever you have not completed or graduated from. Basically, you can use the Po to cultivate and attempt to accomplish completion in this lifetime. So what I'm getting at is ways of practicing and cultivating through movement, the somatic experience of standing by a tree and the Qigong posture. Also, the understanding that you can get just from communicating with trees, these sentient or sensual beings, to understand these parts of yourself that you might not quite know and understand yet. You can use trees may become your teacher or ally as you explore these practices. And if you also are the type of person that learns through journaling, then that's something that was encouraged and I've done basically since 2016 on and off. But I've kept some interesting journals and themes that I can look back on my life. Basically, questions like, to grow in life, do you need challenges? And do you consider yourself an old soul who has it easy? What are some of the obstacles that you have faced in life? And also maybe you don't care about accomplishments. So how can you transcend the issues of this life? These are just some questions that you can consider in the practice of the standing tree meditation. So I'm going to start with ginkgo. That ginkgo is a Chinese herb in the modern materia medica. It comes from the ginkgo nut, and it's called baiguo. It actually comes from the female plants, and it forms that olive-like ovule that you'll see, the medicinal part that's used. Actually, the ginkgo tree has a very unique reproductive process similar to aquatic plant ancestors. So after fertilization, these ovules produce almond-like seeds, which are coated in fleshy yellow to orange pulp. Another unique thing about the ginkgo tree is that basically they include gymnosperms or naked seed plants. So they were part of the earliest group of plants to evolve beyond spores, beyond aquatic plants, and develop true seeds. So the ginkgo tree is the first level of consciousness. Basically, it's the first Po. So that helps us to understand the first concept of 7, which is the physicality of form. So this includes self-image, having wealth, having clothes, having cars. Ginkgo also helps to overcome the lower steps of the Po in your life, is your life about physical needs? Can you think of times or events in your life that have affected your self-image and sort of the physicality of your form in attraction to things like wealth and clothes and cars, etc. So ginkgo is that first level. And if you look at the shape of the ginkgo leaf, it basically looks kind of like a heart that you can see. Also, it is almost divided into two halves. So in Daoist theory, nothingness comes from somethingness and is divided into the two complementary forces, both yin and yang. So you can kind of see that division of this unity, the two fishes, the yin and the yang. So it has a heart shape to it, and also it's symbolic of the yin and yang returning to nothingness. So also the ginkgo tree is considered the elder of the forest, and it has the ancient and wise embodiment of the Tao. The next tree or category of trees that we'll look at are the thorny trees. This is the second level of consciousness. This level is about concepts itself. So even just by me presenting a lecture on the topic of learning about the corporal soul, this is basically exemplifying that second level of consciousness, which is about concepts. So where are you stuck within your storyline? If you reference some things from the classical texts, the Ling Shu, which is called the spiritual pivot, they'll have analogies to things like thorns, things that you can pull out, stains, things that you can wash out, knots, or things that you can untie, and or obstructions, things that you can break up. So basically, these are the four manifestations of disease. And thorny trees in particular, again, ask what can you pull out and where are you stuck within your storyline in life. And a thorny tree that I have found growing in my area, and maybe you've encountered before, also a Chinese herb, chanjia, is hawthorn. And we use hawthorn to realize your physical needs are not as important as other levels of consciousness in terms of spiritual practice or cultivation. Thorns help those who no longer feel efficient. What if you could never discover beauty or goodness in the world, sort of based off of that first level of consciousness and the physical needs of physical form? Also, what if you didn't really care? That's sort of moving into the second level of concept. Thorns help you to deal also with those issues. As long as you have what you need, it doesn't really matter how fancy it is. So this second level of consciousness, which is about concept, is no longer being attached to form, but recognizing what it does and what it represents. And this was basically the little shoots that came off of the hawthorn trunk, and they are definitely very thorny. Also, interestingly, the category of acupuncture points called the yang source points. Sorry, that was a typo on my part. It's supposed to be the yuan, as in Y-U-A-N. But I'm just going to keep going with my slides because that is what's up. Anyways, the yuan source points treat the thorns and the stains, the knots and the obstructions, the things that do cause chronic conditions or chronic disease. This is a reminder from that classical text, the Ling Shu, or spiritual pivot, how acupuncture is not only treating disease, but also rather it can be giving us direction to help us sort of have an entrance into our soul or a direction in our lives towards completion. So I'm going to refer to large intestine 4 on the next slide, which is a source point, a yuan source point on the hand Taiyang, Yang Ming channel. And I have a photo of its location, which is basically just where your thumb and index finger meet. This is the location of large intestine 4. This point in particular, which is a Yuan source point, helps with certain heavy or turbid aspects of Po that could affect you. So things that would help you in the practice of refinement to release guilt, shame, and regret. So this was actually a product line of essential oils that I had owned in the past and created with another colleague of mine. We made blends off of the lecture notes that I learned in 2016 to basically just share with various audiences and other people interested in essential oil and Chinese medicine, energetics. But that company I then sold to another local company of herbalists. So you can still get those products, but I don't currently make them anymore. But anyways, the idea of refinement is that human beings are imperfect, myself included. A criticism said years ago that we still carry in our heart, or a haunting memory of something we did can silently live within us. So that particular oil blend for refinement helps us to transform the hurtful experiences that we have accumulated over a lifetime. Basically, what I'm speaking about is the thorny experiences, the second level of consciousness. Our spirit naturally wants to be lighter and transform the burdens that we've carried with us to live a fuller life. So, like buffing dull silver that has become restored again to its original shine with refinement blend, you can wipe away the layers of emotions and experiences that would weigh us down. Underneath it, we find our true selves and therefore have that sort of concept of the sparklingness of gems like silver and gold. So that is a little bit more about the second level of consciousness and how thorny trees might help you to understand these concepts of things like refinement, etc. Another thorny tree that grows in my area that I have found is a holly tree. Holly's all over forests, and there's a lot of cultivated varieties at things like botanical gardens that I've encountered. You can actually use 9 leaves from a holly tree to represent the 9 palaces. 9 palaces include wealth, health, having enough, having prosperity or abundance, also creativity, children, career, wisdom, and home. So these are the 9 palaces, and you can take 9 leaves from a holly tree. You can put them under your pillow at night and project your imagination or fulfillment of any of your dreams, basically any of these themes. And that's another interesting practice that you could try yourself to help to understand what perhaps is inert, or perhaps what you need to understand in order to reach that idea of completion. And this is a photo from the inner landscape body maps. And in the area of our head or brain, we have these 9 mountain peaks, basically, that represent the 9 palaces of completion. And this is a picture of me standing next to a holly tree in that middle dantian posture with my arms level with my chest. This was a tree that I found on an island off of Lake Santila. I was on basically a canoe with a friend and stopped on the little island to take a sort of lunch break. And I found a nice little opening in a holly tree and practiced standing there for some time. So now we're moving on to the third level of consciousness, the third Po, which is matches with the element ash tree. This level of consciousness is about innovation, utility, or meaning. Innovation involves transforming creative concepts into tangible outcomes that improve efficiency. So professions like architecture, engineering, those are examples of very innovative approaches to societal development. And you can use the elm tree in particular to cultivate an inner understanding of the usefulness of what we do, which can actually make our lives more complicated by perhaps creating things like restlessness. I gave the example on this presentation note of the International Space Station. Basically, NASA has a mission statement that is the International Space Station is an unprecedented achievement in global human endeavors to build and utilize a research platform in space. And since 2000, that space station evolved from an outpost into a highly capable microgravity laboratory. The results are compounding with new benefits that are emerging, and it's in its third decade, basically building on research from prior evolutions. So yeah, the International Space Station, I would say I'm personally fascinated by it, just because I grew up being sort of like a space nerd, but also I do sometimes wonder why we invest so much of resources, basically capital, in that sort of exploration. And you could justify that there are a lot of very perhaps innovative and meaningful research that comes out of it, especially if you're a scientist or an engineer working on projects as such. Or you could perhaps consider that it is something that makes our lives more complicated. Another tree at this third level of consciousness, which is utility and meaning and innovation, is the ash tree. So the ash tree is a guardian in the forest. It's a teacher in the plant world, useful for people who have experienced a lot of disappointments. Sometimes people who have experienced a lot of disappointments move to nature, basically to be alone, but also to be in nature. The word Fraxini is the Latin for ash tree. If you drink the tea leaf of Fraxini, it will give you clues about what's happening in the forest. Also, if you use wood ash over the center of the chest at Ren 17, it perhaps will give you foresight from ancestral deities. Again, I'm referencing these 2016 lecture notes that I learned from Jeffrey Yuen, but I just wanted to add those because I thought it was very interesting, and some of these things I haven't even tried yet. So just reminders to myself. Also, you could use the wood of the wood ash tree as a wand for magic, basically something like a dowsing rod in that shape. You could use the wood of an ash tree for gua sha or even acupuncture needles. It has the certain energetics of the tree itself, and then perhaps it also could teach you something about the plant world or act as a guardian energetically. Also, you can use ash wood for wooden swords in Tai Chi. That will help to hold your energy or transmit healing energy. And so think of these references to gua sha needles, swords, and dowsing rods as practices of divination. Again, not the focus, but definitely an interest of mine that I might explore more in the near future. The fourth level of consciousness, or the fourth Po, is called the bridge. It's the initiation in between basically that physical form and then the spiritual or immaterial formlessness. You can use the maple tree to understand more about our sensitivities and adaptabilities. Basically, the maple leaf has these 5 lobes that are to help us adjust to the 5 directions. And a little bit more about the maple tree. Yeah, it's moving from physical to immaterial. So use maple to try to cultivate how everything in life has a meaning. It's manifested in form, it's utilized for its significance, and then let it go. Maple is useful for everything in life that has meaning. Uh, Also, that the bridge in between the first three levels of consciousness, physicality of form, the thorny, and the concepts themselves, or the innovation. Also, uh, from innovation and attachment to physicality, you can start to imagine letting go of attachment concepts, basically forgetting allegiances and alliances, reducing attachments to physicality. There are a lot of plants that do not require as much, how do you say, as many things. And those categories of plants are often used in cultivation practices. So some examples are mushrooms, and they don't need sunlight to grow. Certain mushrooms like reishi would help to cultivate certain levels of consciousness, or perhaps learning how to live without as much need for the physicality of form. Let's see, other cactuses that don't need as much water to live. You can use certain cactuses for understanding um, levels of consciousness, particularly plant medicine. And there's a third one, but it's not coming to mind right now. But so far, I've referenced the mushrooms, dry desert plants or cactuses, and I can't remember the third one. But yeah, the initiation is also included in the four alchemical stages that start with purification, and then goes into refinement, initiation before completion. So the fifth level of consciousness is the liberation of the soul. Basically, it is any scaly tree, and scaly trees have that sort of sacred geometry. They help us to liberate the soul or enter the world of magic. Magical designs can help you to see a deeper interpretation, see the world with a different filter, understand the essence, which is beyond its concept. The fifth level of consciousness is knowing that through cultivating this fifth po, or liberating the soul, you may experience the presence of the divine. There's something greater than yourself, having a sacred communion or connection with the divinity, or essence. No, beginning to understand that everything actually emerges from within ourselves. So, the example of greatness in nature is as a laboratory to understand ourselves. But ultimately, within some of these Taoist concepts, particularly this fifth level of consciousness, we can learn what we don't yet understand. Also, we can use the energetic of these trees, the scaly ones like spruce, fir, cypress, or cedar, juniper, for example, other things that you want to shed about yourself in the practice of making your spirit lighter, where you may also feel uncomfortable in between these other worlds, these other dimensions. It can be a hard transition for some. The fifth level of consciousness, you don't know what to do at times. Maybe it's a difficult dimension, how to coexist without feeling the difficulties of the other dimensions, basically of the other spirit worlds. So that has definitely been a struggle of mine. This past summer, I was invited. I was invited by my teacher Lindsey to visit the Five Immortals Temple, and I went with a group of her other students, and including Sam, and we practiced some. We did some temple practices, and also sort of lived without a lot of the the physical comforts of the world. I think personally, I have been drawn to a lot of Taoist philosophy, obviously a lot of Taoist medicine and healing as a practitioner. But I do at this point in my life still struggle with some of the Taoist ritual. And I think it's because there is a part of me that knows that it is tricky. I know that I have struggled with some of the trickiness of it, and that has made me feel definitely uncomfortable at times. Um, at the temple, I'm trying to think if I didn't have any major experiences of that, like sort of other dimension stuff, but there definitely were some dreams that woke me up with a feeling of presence, basically, a feeling of other forms. And so that's something that maybe I was like somewhat expecting, but also not something I really want to dabble with or mess with. So that is the fifth level of consciousness or pose, or at least my understanding at this point. The next one is the sixth level of consciousness, which is experiencing the divine. Pine tree. Pine symbolizes the spirit of the entire forest. Pine represents, like, if you were at the Acadia National Forest, where I learned from Jeffrey Yuen about the entire forest, pine represents all of that forest. Pine trees help us to connect you to endlessness, to divinity. Also, pine has the energetics of letting go of anything that's very old by stimulating that lung energy, large intestine, helping to let go. And what another place to reference the energetics of basically these trees, according to Chinese medicine, or even the energetics and essence of tree oils, would be to look up the Bach tree essences. That's spelled BACH, and they have a product line. Also, Alchemica Botanica, that was a product line of essential oils, also started by another student of Jeffrey's. And there's a lot of really interesting trees that have really great explanations that you can use energetically to understand and work with these trees in their medicine themselves. So the pine tree, again, that sixth level of consciousness, which is about experiencing the divine. I just want to mention another sort of treatment aspect of the pine energetics. Also, so what I know is in the more modern materia medica, pine is listed as in it's called Songjie, and it is in a category that I basically don't have a lot of personal reference with. Like, I have not used that Chinese herb. I don't have it in stock, but it's in the materia medica, so it does date back. And the energetics of the pine would be something that you could make or create. You could take pine needles that you harvest in the spring, and you could put them in brandy, and you actually layer it with layers of turbinado, or that brown sugar, and you put those on spider veins, which are located along mostly people's legs, but also other parts of the body, perhaps. And so when you put them on the spider veins, medicinally, it can help you to treat the low vessels. The low vessels are basically points that energetically would help with psycho-emotional issues that you put away to deal with later. So I just thought that was interesting. And since I do not use the Chinese herb Songjie like at all, really, I can't say that I ever have in a formula, but maybe I will someday. That is something else to try, and a pretty easy recipe to make. Just need basically a handful of pine needles. Yeah, and also these are the pine nodes. So if you ever made a T with the pine needles and you were using some Daoist numerology to count it, basically this is one segment. This is one node. So this would be 3 nodes. It's not that you're not counting those individual needles. It's like the entire segment of them. So just so that makes sense. The seventh Po is our dead trees, and dead trees help with the level of consciousness of graduation. The Po that reminds us that everything dies and that death is the beginning of something new. In Taoism or Buddhism, there's often reference to nothing dies, and as in everything evolves. This is the returning back home. It's another transition or dimension in time. It transcends the planes we are in. This actually makes me think of those other, probably, I guess, experience, liberation of the soul or sort of like connection to divinity. But one of those students, one of the herbalists that was with Joe Hollis at the end of his life, she was actually the person that was doing a shift in the wee hours of the night, and she had sort of stepped out of the room. And as the story goes, that was when Joe like passed away, as in when he transitioned. But she so she knew that happened eventually, and she went outside, and one of the first things she saw was a shooting star. So for whatever that may have meaning to you, but also it was just a pretty significant event that my friend, the herbalist, had witnessed at that time. Yeah, and in terms of that concept of dead trees or graduation, emotions associated with death can cause difficulty, but basically it's that resistance to the emotion that potentially could lead to negativity. Again, with this concept of Buddhist or Taoist concept of reincarnation, the Po wants to materialize to have an existence in a physical form. So that's just something to ponder. So now I'm wrapping up this presentation. We've learned about 7 trees or 7 levels of consciousness. You can practice standing meditation next to a tree to understand what the Po is. You could keep a journal. You could study the numerology of trees and use a little bit of basic botany, basic taxonomy. Basically, the leaves are almost always available, except in the fall with deciduous trees, but evergreens, you can always find the scaly ones or the piney ones. You can also find a tree, anyone other than the 7 that I mentioned, to find or discover parts of yourself, parts of who you are. For the medicinal energetics of the trees, you can reference alchemical botanica, that's for Chinese medicine energetics, or Bach tree essence, and that's a lot for psycho-emotional energetics in medicine. These are the final slides that I have of the forest fires. It was called the Bootleg Fire of 2021. This is at Lindsey Way's land in Southern Oregon. It was in a pretty primitive, remote area. And the way in which it looked to me was astounding. And I know that I was not the only one in the group that had that experience of witnessing that level of basically destruction. It almost looked like another planet. Like if you look at this photo, it's where the trunk of a tree had blown out and burnt. So it was very ashy, like about maybe like a foot deep. All the trees that were still standing were just, torched all the way through, and probably in time would just fall back into the earth. Here's some other photos. This was taken from higher up on a sort of mesa, on a cliff that you could climb, and when looking down, it had the like sort of sepia tone of photo, but this is without altering the photos. This is just how it looked. Everything was this basically colorlessness, black and white, or that sort of muted sepia tones. So I included these pictures just because they actually are dead trees that could be useful for that seventh level of consciousness in the poem completion or graduation. Also, just because these images are like forever burned in my memory. And yeah, there is um, a lot that I could say about climate change and global warming. Um, these are more photos from Lindsey's land. But I do remember back in 2016 when I was with Jeffrey Yuen during the lecture in the Acadia National Forest, one thing he had mentioned that seemed relatable to climate change is that so the planet is becoming more young, it's warming up, it's heating up, and we have the moon, which is more yin. The moon affects the tides, it affects the waters. He said that as the planet Earth is warming up and becoming more young, it is balanced out by the moon, the yin energetics. And so basically, the moon is moving more water with hurricanes, with floods, with tsunamis in onto the planet Earth to cool it off. Basically, it's trying to harmonize between the, hot and cold, uh, the excesses. And I thought that was interesting also because what he had mentioned is due to this climate change, it was actually created sort of the best growing environment for things like reishi mushrooms, which are in the materia medica. I mentioned them before. It's a Ganoderma mushroom, the big tonic. But that mushroom, according to Jeffrey, it wasn't as abundant at one point in time. But after the 1950s, he said that the basically climate change had made it so that there was more growth, more production. Basically, is more readily available to find the reishi mushrooms. And I live in an area where there's a lot of fallen hemlock trees. They've been affected by basically insect that is invasive to hemlock trees, and so they're also decaying or dying in the forest from that. And as they fall back to the earth and sort of become, compost, you can find a lot of reishi mushrooms growing on them, and you can use that for medicine. Jeffrey mentioned that perhaps that mushroom is helpful for humanity because it is helping us to shift in our human consciousness. So the other, I just was going to go back to, there's the three categories of plants that help to, are useful for cultivation. Plants that are listed, including fungus and cactuses, and also plants that don't need the earth or the soil to grow. And that third one is the lotus plant, which has 5 medicinals listed in the Materia Medica. Basically, plants that are most spiritual by nature, growing away from sunlight, water, soil, growing away from the necessities of life. And in terms of spirituality, it means spiritual practices do relate to having less reliance on the basics of life, or aesthetic practices, or periods of fasting, retreats, meditation, silence. It's through those practices that basically you may experience the endless possibilities, oracles, awakenings, etc. So the next slide is of a fallen tree in my neighborhood. This was after Hurricane Helene. This was a neighbor's tree that fell, and I think it is a fir tree. Maybe it's a spruce tree. No, I think it's a fir tree. But anyways, I didn't mention that in the lecture notes. It just fell down. The wind was basically so great, and it was a very tall tree that any tall trees just totally got uprooted. So that was in my neighbor's yard. There is this photo loading next, and this is a bunch of other evergreen pine trees that had fallen all over an embankment in another neighborhood in town, and they had to clear the road, so some of them are actually chopped so that it wasn't blocking the road, but basically it was just a lot of debris, and that's what the land looks like in many areas at this point, like pretty devastated, pretty destructive. And the next photo is, let me see if it loads, but this is in my backyard, and it is of the, give me a second, maple tree that fell. This was basically a very tall maple tree that had a bunch of trunks that had sort of segmented or split. But this was an uprooted tree from the winds after the storm. This is also in the backyard of just the woods behind my house that have all these fallen trees. This is the cherry tree that I saw that at the beginning of the storm when I first woke up. I went to my kitchen sink to wash the dishes and looked out my window, and this cherry tree, just the top of it popped off, and then that landed and fell in the yard, but luckily it didn't hit my house. So yeah, that is it. Thanks for listening to this presentation on the nature of trees. I hope that you found some interesting practices that become useful in your own life, and perhaps you will begin to better understand what the corporal soul is simply by standing next to a tree, by communing between that mediumship between heaven and earth. So, thanks for listening.